Rent in the UK is no longer just expensive, it's punitive. Millions of people are paying more than half their income just to keep a roof over their heads. And for the first time in decades, renting isn't a temporary phase anymore. It's a trap. Every year, rents rise faster than wages, deposits drift further out of reach, and renters are told the same thing. Wait it out, the market will cool. But it isn't cooling, it's tightening. Behind the headlines about record rents is a far more uncomfortable reality. The UK rental market is structurally broken, supply is shrinking, demand is exploding, and policy decisions made years ago are now colliding all at once. Landlords are selling, councils are overwhelmed, and renters are absorbing the cost of a system that no longer works for anyone except those who already own assets. Today, we're going to break down how the UK rent crisis reached this point, why prices keep rising even as living standards fall, who really benefits from the chaos, and what happens next if nothing fundamentally changes. Number 10. What happens if the UK rent crisis is not fixed? If the UK rent crisis is not fixed, the consequences will extend far beyond housing and begin to reshape society itself. Renting will shift from a transitional phase of life into a permanent condition for millions, regardless of age or income. As rents continue to rise faster than wages, disposable income will shrink, consumer spending will weaken, and financial resilience will collapse for large sections of the population. Households will delay or abandon major life decisions. Fewer people will start families. Workforce mobility will decline as workers become trapped near jobs they can afford, rather than where opportunities exist. Employers in high-rent areas will struggle to recruit, quietly harming productivity and growth. Public services will also absorb the damage. Councils will face soaring temporary accommodation costs as evictions rise and affordability thresholds are breached. Homelessness will increase, not just among the vulnerable, but among working families. This shifts the rent crisis from a private hardship to a taxpayer-funded emergency. Most critically, inequality will harden. Asset owners will continue to benefit from scarcity-driven rent growth, while renters fall further behind, unable to save or accumulate security. Without intervention, the UK risks creating a permanent renter underclass, not by accident, but by policy inaction. Number 9. Who profits from the UK rent crisis? Despite the widespread pain caused by the rent crisis, it is not a market failure for everyone. In fact, certain groups benefit directly from the sustained imbalance between supply and demand. Large institutional landlords, property funds, and build-to-rent operators are among the biggest winners. With limited competition and constant tenant demand, they can raise rents annually with minimal vacancy risk. Scarcity has shifted power decisively toward asset holders. When renters have few alternatives, landlords can prioritize yield over affordability. This is especially true in urban centers, where professional management, scale efficiencies, and strong tenant pipelines reduce operational risk. Rising rents translate into higher valuations, reinforcing wealth accumulation at the top. Financial institutions also benefit indirectly. Higher rental yields support lending activity and investment products tied to property performance. Meanwhile, short-term letting platforms extract value from housing stock that would otherwise serve long-term residents, further tightening supply. On the other side, renters absorb the cost through reduced savings, delayed home ownership, and increased financial stress. The wealth gap widens as property ownership becomes both a shield and a weapon in an undersupplied market. The rent crisis, then, is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of scarcity economics, where those who control housing assets gain leverage while those without ownership pay the price. Number 8. Are rent controls a real solution? As rents spiral, calls for rent controls have grown louder. driven by frustration and desperation rather than consensus. At first glance, caps appear to offer immediate relief by limiting how much landlords can charge. For tenants facing double-digit increases, this promise is politically powerful. However, the long-term effects are far more complex. Poorly designed rent controls can reduce supply further. When landlords are unable to adjust rents to rising costs, some exit the market entirely or defer maintenance, degrading housing quality. New investment also slows as developers avoid markets where returns are restricted. This ultimately tightens availability, making competition for remaining properties even more intense. That does not mean all regulation fails. Targeted controls linked to inflation and paired with strong tenant protections can stabilize vulnerable households in the short term. But controls alone cannot fix a structural shortage. Without parallel investment in new housing, especially social and affordable units, caps merely freeze pressure in place. The core risk is mistaking symptom management for solution. Rent controls address price pain but not volume scarcity. If policymakers rely on caps without expanding supply, the crisis may become less visible but more entrenched, leaving renters no closer to long-term security. Number 7. Councils, homelessness, and temporary housing costs. As rents rise beyond affordability, councils are increasingly forced to absorb the consequences of the rental market's failure. When households are priced out or evicted, local authorities have a legal duty to prevent homelessness, and that responsibility comes at a rapidly escalating cost. Temporary accommodation, once a short-term solution, has become a long-term fixture for thousands of families. Hotels, hostels, and emergency placements are now used for months or even years. These arrangements are expensive, unstable, and damaging to family life, particularly for children. Councils often pay far above market rates per household, diverting funds away from preventative services, infrastructure, and housing development. This creates a financial feedback loop. As council budgets strain, investment in new social housing is delayed or reduced, increasing reliance on the private rental sector, the very system driving homelessness in the first place. Rising rents push more households toward crisis, further inflating temporary housing demand. The rent crisis therefore becomes a taxpayer-funded emergency rather than a private market issue. Costs are socialized while the structural shortage remains unresolved. Without intervention to stabilize rents and expand genuinely affordable housing, councils will continue firefighting indefinitely, spending more each year to manage decline rather than prevent it. Number 6. Students, migration, and rental pressure. Students and migration are often blamed for the UK rent crisis, but they are not the root cause. They act as pressure multipliers in a system that was already undersupplied. Universities have expanded student numbers aggressively over the past decade, yet purpose-built student accommodation has not kept pace in many cities. As a result, students spill into the private rental sector, competing directly with working households. And migration adds a similar layer of demand. New arrivals overwhelmingly rent, particularly in urban centres where jobs are concentrated. This increases competition at the lower and middle end of the market, where supply is already tight. The issue is not demand growth itself, but the failure to scale housing alongside it. When multiple demand streams collide, students, migrants, young professionals, and displaced renters, the effect is cumulative. Landlords do not need to choose between tenants. Tenants compete against one another. This allows rents to rise rapidly without improvements in quality or security. Crucially, focusing on demand groups distracts from policy failure. Population growth is predictable. Student intake is planned. Migration targets are set nationally. Housing supply, however, remains fragmented, slow, and politically constrained, Until housing delivery matches demographic reality, these groups will continue to intensify pressure, not because they exist, but because the system failed to prepare for them. Number 5. Why young renters are permanently locked out. For a growing share of young renters, the UK housing system no longer offers a path forward, only a holding pattern with rising costs. Rents have increased far faster than entry-level wages, leaving little to no disposable income after basic living expenses. Saving for a deposit, once difficult, has become mathematically impossible for many households, even those with stable employment. This lockout is structural, not behavioral. Young renters are not spending irresponsibly. They are paying market prices in a market defined by scarcity. Each rent increase pushes ownership further away, while higher interest rates raise deposit and affordability thresholds at the same time. The gap widens from both ends. Frequent moves also play a role. Short tenancies and rent hikes force renters to relocate repeatedly, disrupting careers, relationships, and financial planning. Stability, the foundation of long-term saving, is absent. Without security, risk tolerance collapses, and long-term commitments are postponed indefinitely. The result is a generational reset. Renting is no longer a stepping stone, but a permanent condition. Wealth accumulation shifts almost entirely to asset owners, while renters absorb volatility without upside. This is not a temporary affordability issue. It is a structural exclusion that redefines who can participate in housing wealth and who cannot. Number 4. The landlord exit myth. What's really happening? The claim that landlords leaving the market will reduce rents is one of the most persistent myths surrounding the UK rent crisis. While it is true that many small landlords are selling, the effect on renters has been the opposite of what was promised. When a landlord sells, the property does not disappear, but in most cases it leaves the rental sector entirely and becomes owner-occupied. Each sale removes a rental unit from an already undersupplied market. Demand remains unchanged, but available stock shrinks further, intensifying competition for remaining properties. This pushes rents higher, not lower. Fewer landlords does not mean less pressure, it means more leverage for those who stay. What is happening is consolidation, not collapse. Individual landlords are exiting, but larger operators and cash-rich buyers are absorbing stock where yields justify it. This shifts the market toward professionalized ownership, often with less flexibility and higher baseline rents. Regulation and tax changes may be justified on policy grounds, but their short-term effect has been to reduce supply faster than demand. Without a parallel increase in housing construction or social provision, landlord exits simply redistribute scarcity. The rental market cannot correct itself through attrition alone. Supply reduction in a high-demand environment guarantees upward price pressure regardless of who owns the remaining homes. Number 3. Wage stagnation versus rent inflation. At the core of the UK rent crisis is a widening gap between what people earn and what housing costs. While rents have surged at double-digit rates in many regions, wages have increased slowly, if at all, after adjusting for inflation. This divergence has fundamentally altered affordability. Rent is no longer a manageable expense. It is the dominant financial burden for millions of households. When rents rise faster than incomes, renters lose flexibility. Essentials like food, transport, and energy are squeezed, and saving becomes impossible. Even modest rent increases can push households from coping to crisis. This is particularly acute for key workers and lower middle-income earners who do not qualify for assistance but cannot absorb rising costs. The long-term impact is economic drag. High rent reduces labor mobility, as workers cannot afford to move closer to better-paying jobs. It also suppresses productivity, as financial stress increases turnover and burnout. Entire sectors struggle to recruit in high-rent areas, quietly undermining growth. Unlike previous cycles, renters cannot rely on wage catch-up. Global competition, automation, and weak productivity growth limit pay rises. Without intervention, rent inflation will continue to outpace earnings, locking affordability pressures into the system and normalizing financial insecurity for a generation. Number 2, how supply shortages are crushing renters. The single most powerful force behind the UK rent crisis is a chronic shortage of housing supply, particularly homes suitable for long-term renting. For years, construction has failed to keep pace with population growth, household formation, and changing living patterns. Even in periods of economic slowdown, the deficit has continued to widen, leaving renters to compete for an ever-shrinking pool of properties. Planning delays, local opposition, and rising construction costs have slowed new development to a crawl in many areas. Developers prioritize higher margin projects, often targeting luxury or build-to-rent schemes that sit above what average renters can afford. Meanwhile, social housing construction remains far below historical levels, removing a crucial pressure valve from the system. The result is extreme competition. Viewings attract dozens of applicants. Properties are rented within hours. Renters offer months of rent up front or accept higher prices simply to secure stability. In this environment, quality and affordability become secondary to availability. Supply shortages also reduce renter power. When options are limited, tenants cannot negotiate, challenge poor conditions, or walk away from unfair increases. Scarcity shifts all leverage to landlords. Until supply expands meaningfully, every other policy response operates at the margins, treating symptoms while the underlying shortage continues to drive rents higher. Number 1. Why UK rents are rising faster than ever. UK rents are rising faster than ever because multiple long-term pressures are now converging at the same time. Demand has grown steadily due to population increases, smaller household sizes, and delayed homeownership, while supply has failed to respond at anything close to the required scale. This imbalance alone would push rents higher, but recent shocks have intensified the effect. Higher interest rates have reshaped landlord behavior. Increased mortgage costs are passed directly to tenants wherever the market allows. At the same time, regulatory changes and tax pressures have discouraged new small landlords from entering the market, reducing competition. Existing landlords facing higher costs and strong demand raise rents to protect margins. Post-pandemic movement patterns have also played a role. As workers returned to cities, demand surged in urban centres already short of housing. Remote work did not reduce demand as expected. Instead, it redistributed it unevenly, pushing rents up across wider regions. Crucially, renters cannot opt out. Housing demand is inelastic. People must live somewhere regardless of price. When supply is constrained and demand is unavoidable, prices rise rapidly. This is not a temporary spike driven by speculation. It is a structural acceleration rooted in scarcity, policy choices, and economic reality. Without a major shift in housing delivery and affordability strategy, rising rents are not an anomaly. They are the new baseline.